For Marcella Thornapple, at 70 years old, 50 years of marriage ended with a cardboard box on a rain-soaked driveway and an ex-husband who didn't even bother to come outside, while his new 34-year-old wife watched from the upstairs window of the home Marcie had decorated for 3 decades. Her 2 adult children stood on their father's side of the lawyer's table. Her share of half a century of building a life together came out to $18,000, barely enough to cover 4 months of any apartment in their coastal Connecticut town. And when Marcie took the certified letter that arrived 6 weeks later and drove 11 hours up the Maine coast to claim a crumbling lighthouse that her own family had never heard of, everyone said she had finally cracked. But Marcie had seen something in that abandoned tower that 50 years of buried marine engineering knowledge she had shelved at 22 to follow Lionel's dreams instead of her own, had recognized in a single glance. And with her own hands at 70 years old, on a forgotten point of granite where no one had lived for 40 years, she began to bring a dead light back to life. What Marcie restored on that headland left maritime historians breathless. But what she rebuilt inside herself, the engineer she had silenced, the woman who had spent half a century making everyone else's dreams possible, changed everything. This is Marcie's story. Proof that the light inside you doesn't go out just because someone stopped tending it. 70 isn't too late. And the most powerful comeback isn't revenge. It's finally becoming who you were always meant to be. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcella Thornapple was 70 years old when she learned that 50 years of marriage could be erased in the time it took to sign 3 pages of paperwork. She stood in the driveway of what had been her home since 1989, watching the moving company she had not hired carry out boxes she had not packed, while a thin October rain soaked through the only winter coat Lionel's lawyer had allowed her to take. The coat was 12 years old. Lionel had bought her 3 newer ones over the years, but those had been classified as marital assets purchased with his business income, and the lawyer had been very clear about which items legally belonged to which person. The coffee maker she had used every morning for 19 years was marital property. The reading chair she had nursed both her children in was marital property. The wedding china her own grandmother had passed down to her in 1974 was, somehow, also marital property because it had been commingled with the household. Marcie had stopped fighting individual items by the 3rd meeting. There was no point. Lionel had been planning this for at least 2 years, and by the time she understood what was happening, the legal architecture had already been built around her like a cage made of signatures she had trusted her husband to handle. Lionel Thornapple was 72 years old, and for the past 18 months, he had been quietly transferring the bulk of their assets into a holding company in his name alone. The construction firm he had built, the firm Marcie had helped him start in 1976 by cashing out her graduate school savings, by typing his bid proposals at the kitchen table after the children went to sleep, by hosting client dinners, and managing the books for the first 11 years before they could afford a proper accountant. That firm was on paper his sole property. The vacation house in Mystic was in his name. The investment portfolio that had grown to nearly $4 million over 5 decades of careful saving was, through a series of legal maneuvers Marcie had signed without reading, because Lionel had said it was just routine estate planning, almost entirely his. Her share, after the divorce attorney explained what the law could and could not recover, was $18,000 and the contents of 1 cardboard box. Skye Vandermeer was 34 years old. She had been Lionel's executive assistant for 3 years before the affair started, and his fiancée for the last 6 months of his marriage. Marcie had not known about her until the divorce papers arrived, though looking back, the signs had been there for at least a year. The late nights at the office, the new gym membership, the sudden interest in his appearance after a decade of comfortable indifference. Marcie had told herself it was a midlife thing. Marcie had told herself a lot of things over 50 years. "Mom, you have to understand Dad's position," her son Bryson had said, 2 days after the divorce was finalized. He was 47, a commercial real estate broker who worked closely with his father's firm. "He gave you $18,000. He didn't have to give you anything. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, not community property. You should be grateful. Grateful. Marcie had repeated the word silently after she hung up. Grateful for $18,000 after 50 years of being a wife, a mother, the unpaid backbone of a construction empire that was now valued at over $12 million. Grateful that her firstborn, the baby she had labored 31 hours to deliver, the boy she had read to every night until he was 9 years old, had chosen his father's checkbook over his mother's dignity. Her daughter Cameron had been quieter, but no kinder. I'm not picking sides, Mom. I just think you need to be realistic about your future. You can't afford to be bitter at your age. Realistic about her future. As if Marcie had any future left to be realistic about. She had been a marine engineering student at the University of Rhode Island when she met Lionel in the spring of 1974. She had been 21 years old, in the final semester of an undergraduate degree, with conditional acceptance to a graduate program in coastal structural engineering at MIT. She had wanted to design lighthouses, breakwaters, harbor systems. She had wanted to spend her life understanding how human structures stood against the sea. Lionel had been a charming construction foreman 6 years her senior who had told her, on their fourth date, that a woman as smart as her shouldn't have to work, that he would build something big enough for both of them, and she could do whatever she wanted on the side. They had married in October. By Christmas, she was pregnant. By the following spring, her MIT acceptance had quietly expired, and the textbooks she had once underlined in 3 colors of ink had been packed into a milk crate and put in the basement of their first house, where they had stayed, untouched, for 49 years. She was thinking about that milk crate when the certified letter arrived. It was 6 weeks after the divorce. She was living in a weekly rate motel off Route 1, surviving on instant oatmeal and the kindness of a front desk clerk who had stopped charging her for the microwave use. The letter was from a law firm in Bangor, Maine, that she had never heard of. The attorney's name was Octavian Rensselaer. She read the letter 3 times before she understood what it was saying. Her great-aunt Persephone Caraway, a woman Marcie had not seen since she was 9 years old, a woman her mother had once called the strange one who went up the coast and never came back, had died in August at the age of 96. And in the long, slow process of settling an estate that nobody in the family had bothered to inquire about, the attorney had finally located Persephone's only living direct descendant, Marcella Thornapple. The estate was modest, the letter said. There was no significant cash. There were no investments. But there was, the letter explained in careful legal language, a piece of real property on a granite headland in Penmarrow Harbor, Maine, that had been in the Caraway family since 1887. A decommissioned lighthouse. Marcie sat on the edge of the motel bed and read the words, Tide Flint Point Light, and felt something move inside her chest that had not moved in a very long time. She did not know it yet, but the woman who had been silenced for 50 years had just been handed a key. The drive to Bangor took 6 hours in Marcie's 11-year-old Subaru, the only vehicle registered in her name alone. She had not driven that far by herself since she was a graduate student. Lionel had always handled long drives, chosen the routes, decided when they would stop. For the first 100 miles, Marcie kept catching herself glancing at the empty passenger seat as if waiting to be told she was going the wrong way. By the second 100 miles, the silence in the car had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like something else. Something she did not yet have a word for. Octavian Rensselaer's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted 19th-century brick building near the river. He was a small, precise man in his late 70s, with white hair combed flat against his skull and a gray cardigan that looked older than Marcie's marriage. He stood up when she walked in, shook her hand with both of his, and said, "Mrs. Thornapple, I am very sorry it took me 4 months to find you. Your mother's family did an unusually good job of disappearing from each other." Marcie sat down across from him. "I never met my great-aunt. I think I saw her once at a Christmas when I was small. My mother told me she had moved north and didn't want to be in touch with any of us." "That is broadly correct," Mr. Rensselaer said. He opened a manila folder. Persephone Caraway moved to Penmarrow Harbor in 1953 when she was 26 years old. She lived alone at Tide Flint Point Light for the next 68 years. She never married. She had no children. When she could no longer care for herself in 2021, she moved to a small assisted living facility in Bangor, where she lived until this past August. She left explicit instructions that her estate should pass to the eldest surviving female descendant of her sister Vivian, who was your maternal grandmother. He paused, watching Marcie's face. That is you, Mrs. Thornapple. There are no other living candidates. Marcie was quiet for a long moment. What does she do up there? For 68 years. She kept the light, Mr. Rensselaer said. Officially, the lighthouse was decommissioned in 1968. The Coast Guard automated the navigational beacon and moved it to a steel skeleton tower 300 yards down the headland. The original lighthouse and keeper's cottage were declared surplus. Your great-aunt purchased the property at auction in 1969 for $4,000. She lived there alone, without electricity for the first 20 years, without running water for the first 11, until her death. He slid a single black-and-white photograph across the desk. The photograph showed a granite tower rising from a rocky point, perhaps 60 feet tall, with a small attached cottage of the same dark stone. The roof of the cottage was sagging visibly even in the photograph, which Mr. Rensselaer noted had been taken in 1989. The lantern room at the top of the tower was missing several panes of glass. The walkway connecting the cottage to the cliff edge was buckled and broken. I should be honest with you, Mr. Rensselaer said. The property has not been maintained in any meaningful sense for 35 years. Your great-aunt loved it, but she did not have the resources to repair it. The county tax assessor values the land at approximately $22,000. The structures themselves are valued at zero. The access road washes out 3 or 4 times each winter. The well casing is failing. The septic system is older than I am. Marcie picked up the photograph. She studied it the way she had once studied the engineering plates in her textbooks, looking past the surface to the structure underneath. Granite ashlar masonry, probably built between 1880 and 1890 based on a lantern room style. The buckling in the walkway suggested foundation movement, but the tower itself was plumb in the photograph, meaning the granite footing on the headland was holding. The roof sag in the cottage was a rafter problem, not a load-bearing wall problem. Reparable. Expensive, but reparable. She did not realize she was thinking like an engineer until she had already been doing it for a full minute. I'd like to see it, she said. Mr. Rensselaer nodded slowly. Most people who inherit property like this sell it for whatever they can get and walk away. I would not blame you if that is what you decided. But your great-aunt left one specific instruction, which I am required to share with you in person. He read aloud from a typed page. To whoever comes after me, do not sell the light to anyone who only sees stone. The Caraway women have kept this point for 134 years. We have done so because someone has to remember that not every light is meant to be useful. Some lights are meant only to be kept. Marcie felt the words settle somewhere underneath her sternum. She called Cameron that evening from a diner in Penmarrow Harbor. She had driven the additional 90 minutes up the coast on impulse, and she was now sitting in a booth eating a cup of clam chowder she could not really afford, looking out the window at a granite point she could not quite see clearly through the dusk. Mom, please tell me you are not going to do what I think you are going to do. I haven't decided what I'm doing. It's a ruined lighthouse. In Maine. In November. Mom, you're 70 years old. You have $18,000. You cannot move into a building that doesn't have plumbing and pretend you're some kind of pioneer woman. Cameron, I was a marine engineering student before I was your mother. You were a student, Mom. 50 years ago. You never finished. You never worked. You can't. Marcie hung up. She sat in the booth for a long time, watching the headland disappear into the dark. The waitress came by twice to refill her coffee without being asked. The third time, the waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Esme, sat down across from her without invitation and said, "You're going up the tide, Flint, aren't you? I can tell by the way you're looking at it." Marcie nodded slowly. "Then you'd better eat something more than chowder, honey," Esme said. "It's a long walk in from where the road ends." The road to Tide Flint Point ended a quarter-mile short of the lighthouse. Marcie understood why the moment her Subaru's right front tire dropped into a washout the size of a kitchen sink. She backed out carefully, parked on the last patch of solid gravel, and walked the rest of the way with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and the photograph from Mr. Rensselaer's office folded in her coat pocket. The path was rocky, slick with November frost, lined on both sides by salt-burned grass. The wind off the Atlantic came hard enough to make her eyes water. She had to stop twice to catch her breath. She was 70. She had not done sustained physical activity in a decade, and she was walking alone toward a building nobody had heated in over 30 years, with $18,000 to her name and no plan beyond see it for yourself. Then she came around the last bend in the path, and she saw it. Tideflint Point Light stood at the end of a narrow granite finger of land that jutted into the gray Atlantic like the prow of a ship. The tower was taller than the photograph had suggested, closer to 70 feet than 60, and its dark granite skin was streaked with white salt and orange lichen and the long vertical scars of century and a half of weather. The attached keeper's cottage was smaller and lower than the tower, half buried into the slope of the headland for shelter, with a steeply pitched slate roof that sagged in 2 places along the ridgeline. 3 of the cottage's 6 windows were boarded with plywood that had gone gray with age. The front door was painted a faded red that had once probably been the color of a fire engine. Marcie stood at the edge of the path for a long time without moving. The tower was plumb. She could see that even from 100 yards out. The granite was holding, as she had suspected from the photograph, and the lantern room at the top, though missing glass, was still structurally intact. The Fresnel lens housing was gone, removed by the Coast Guard in 1968, but the iron frame that had supported it was visible through the empty window openings, and it looked, even at this distance, sound. The cottage was a different story. The roof would have to come off entirely. The windows were going to need full replacement, not repair. The chimney had partially collapsed at some point and been crudely patched with what looked like roofing tar. The walkway between cottage and cliff edge, the buckled, broken walkway in the photograph, was even worse in person. Whole sections of it were simply gone, fallen into the rocks below. But the bones were there. The bones were good. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcie spent that first night in her car. She had intended to sleep in the cottage, but when she pushed open the red door, the smell that rolled out, mildew, mouse droppings, 68 years of solitary wood smoke, and cold fish suppers, was more than she could face after a 13-hour day. She drove back to the diner instead, ate a plate of meatloaf that Esme refused to charge her for, and slept in the back of the Subaru in the diner's parking lot, wrapped in 2 wool blankets that Esme had brought out without being asked. She woke at 5 in the morning, freezing, her back screaming in 3 places, and lay in the dark of the car for a long time wondering what on earth she thought she was doing. She was a 70-year-old woman with no income, no real housing, and no business, deciding she could repair a structure that professional restoration crews had apparently looked at and walked away from. Cameron was right. Bryson was right. Lionel, in his new mansion in Connecticut with his new young wife, would be right too if he ever bothered to think about her again. She should drive back to the motel, sign whatever paperwork transferred the property to a heritage trust, and use her $18,000 to find a small 1-bedroom apartment somewhere warm where she could quietly wait out the rest of her life. She lay in the dark and let that thought settle. Then she sat up, started the car for warmth, and pulled the photograph out of her coat pocket. She held it under the dashboard light and looked at it again. And for the first time in 50 years, she heard a voice in her head that was not Lionel's, was not her children's, was not the voice of any of the men who had told her over the decades what was and was not a reasonable thing for her to want. The voice said, "The bones are good." The voice said, "You know how to read a structure." The voice said, "You've been waiting 50 years. She drove back to the Lighthouse at first light. She walked the property for 3 hours with a notebook she had bought at a gas station, sketching the cottage from 4 angles, measuring rough dimensions with a tape from her glove compartment, climbing the spiral iron staircase inside the tower 1 careful step at a time, all the way up to the empty lantern room, where the wind came through the broken windows so hard it nearly took her hat. She stood at the top of the tower and looked out over the gray Atlantic and saw, far below her, the rotating beam of the steel skeleton tower the Coast Guard had built 300 yards down the headland, a bright, automated thing doing the practical work of warning ships. The lighthouse she was standing in did no practical work at all anymore. Persephone's letter came back to her. Some lights are meant only to be kept. Marcie stayed at the top of the tower until the wind made her hands too numb to hold a pencil. Then she climbed down the iron staircase, walked back along the headland to her car, and drove into Penmerrow Harbor to find a hardware store. She had decided. The hardware store in Penmerrow Harbor was called Bissett & Sons, and it had been in the same family since 1947. The man behind the counter on Marcie's first morning was a third-generation Bissett named Wally, who looked at her notebook full of sketches and rough material lists with the polite, careful skepticism of a man who had seen plenty of summer people show up in November with big plans and no follow-through. "You doing this work yourself, ma'am?" "I am." "Tied Flint Point?" "Yes." Wally nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods when a patient describes symptoms that worry him. "Persephone's place. You knew her?" "My father did. She came in here every 6 weeks for 50 years. Same list every time. Lamp oil, copper nails, sailcloth, lard. She paid in cash. She never said more than 4 words at a time." He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss. I never knew her." "That doesn't mean it isn't a loss," Wally said. He sold her plywood, tarpaulin, a cast-iron wood stove that had been sitting in the back lot for 2 years, 6 gallons of marine paint, a roll of felt, 20 pounds of galvanized roofing nails, and a second-hand cordless drill. He did not charge her for the drill. When she protested, he said only Persephone's account had a credit balance going back to 1996. "You're using it." She did not believe him, but she did not have the energy to argue, and she suspected, watching his face, that arguing would have been an insult. She moved into the cottage on the 4th day. She had spent 3 days clearing it, hauling out 68 years of newspapers, broken furniture, jars of preserved fish, mouse-eaten quilts, and a crate of marine charts, so brittle they crumbled when she touched them. She kept what she could. She burned what she could not, in a fire pit she dug 10 yards from the cottage. She slept the first 3 nights in her car, and the 4th night on a folding cot in the cleared front room, with the cast-iron stove pumping out enough heat to keep the temperature above 40 degrees and the wind moaning through the broken windows like something alive. She realized somewhere in those first weeks, happier than she had been in 20 years. The work was brutal. Her hands blistered through 2 pairs of leather gloves before she found a rhythm. Her shoulders ached so badly, some mornings she could not lift a coffee cup without using both hands. She fell twice, once off a stepladder repairing soffit, once on the icy walkway, and she lay each time on the cold ground for several minutes before she trusted her body enough to stand. She lost 6 pounds in the first month. She gained back a different 6 pounds in muscle by the end of the second. She started with the cottage roof. She knew, from her old textbooks and from the structural assessment she had run in her head on the first day, that nothing else mattered until the building was watertight. She salvaged what slate she could from the existing roof, ordered the rest from a supplier in Rockland, and rebuilt the rafter system one section at a time using lumber she pulled, board by board, from a collapsed barn an inland farmer was paying to have hauled away. She worked alone. She worked slowly. She worked with the deliberate, methodical care of someone who knew that one mistake at her age and on this terrain would be the end of everything. The windows came next, then the chimney, then the well casing, which she did not repair herself but watched a contractor repair with a level of focused attention that made him stop twice and ask her if she had a question. She did have questions. She had a great many questions. By the end of the day, the contractor, a man in his 50s named Hamish, had stopped explaining things to her and started discussing them with her the way one professional discusses a problem with another. When he loaded his truck to leave, he said, "You sure you weren't an engineer somewhere along the line, Mrs. Thornapple?" "I almost was," Marcie said. He looked at her for a long moment. Almost is a long word. She thought about that for days afterward. The man who changed everything arrived on a Tuesday in late January. She was on the south side of the cottage, replacing a section of granite mortar that had crumbled to the depth of her knuckle, when she heard footsteps on the path behind her. She turned, trowel in hand, expecting Hamish or one of his crew, and instead saw a tall, weathered man in his late 70s with a heavy canvas coat, a wool cap pulled down to his eyebrows, and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by 60 years of standing in salt wind. "Mrs. Thornapple." "Yes. My name is Podrick Kinsley. People call me Patty. I was the assistant keeper here from 1962 to 1968. He paused. "I knew your great-aunt for 53 years. I came to pay my respects to the building." Marcie set down the trowel. She made him coffee on the new stove. They sat at her folding card table, the only table in the cottage, and Patty looked around at what she had done, his eyes moving slowly over the rebuilt rafters, the new windows, the patched mortar, the cleaned and oiled iron stove. He did not say anything for a long time. Finally, he said, "You've been doing this alone?" "Yes." "Since November?" "Yes." He looked at her hands, which were calloused and split at the knuckles in 3 places. He looked at her face. Then he looked out the window at the tower, which she had not yet touched. "Persephone said somebody would come," Patty said quietly. "She said it for 40 years. I thought she was being romantic. She wasn't. She was being patient." He set down his coffee cup. "Mrs. Thornapple, if you'll have me, I'd like to help you with the tower. I won't take a wage. I haven't worked a real lighthouse in 56 years, and I would consider it a personal kindness." Marcie looked at him across the card table for a long time before she answered. She said yes. Patty started the next morning at 7, and within a week Marcie understood that she had not, until that moment, fully grasped what she had taken on. He knew the tower the way a doctor knows a patient he has treated for decades. He knew which mortar joints had been repaired in 1957 and which had been left untouched since 1894. He knew that the iron staircase had been forged in Bath, Maine, by a foundry that had gone out of business in 1923. He knew that the lantern room had been retrofitted twice, and that the second retrofit had compromised the original ventilation system, which was why condensation had eaten through the cast-iron deck plates from below over the next 60 years. He did not lecture Marcie. He worked beside her. When she asked questions, he answered. When she didn't, he stayed quiet. They developed, over the first month of working together, the rhythm of 2 people who had each spent decades being underestimated and had stopped needing to prove anything to each other. By the end of February, the cottage was fully weatherproof. By the end of March, the lower 30 feet of the tower had been repointed. By the second week of April, they had hauled new glass up the iron staircase 1 pane at a time and reglazed the lantern room. It was on the 3rd Saturday of April, while clearing debris from the small storage room at the base of the tower, a room Marcie had been avoiding because it was wedged between the stairwell and the granite cliff face and smelled, even with the windows open, like wet rope, that Patty stopped suddenly with his hand against the back wall. "Marcie!" She came over. He was pressing his palm flat against the granite, and his face had gone very still. "This wall is wrong." "What do you mean?" "The tower is round. The storage room is rectangular because they built an interior partition to square it off. But the depth of this wall..." He stepped back and gestured along the room. "The granite of the tower itself should be 8 feet thick at the base. We're only 10 feet from the staircase. Where's the other 6 feet?" Marcie looked at the wall. Then she looked at her notebook, which she had filled, over 6 months, with measurements of every interior space in the tower and cottage. She flipped back through the pages. She did the arithmetic 3 times. Patty was right. There were 6 feet of unaccounted granite somewhere, behind the back wall of the storage room. It took them 4 hours to find the seam. It was not hidden by craftsmanship. It was hidden by neglect, by 68 years of accumulated dust and salt and old shelving that Persephone had nailed across the wall, and then forgotten about, possibly deliberately. When they finally pulled the last shelf away and Patty ran his fingers along the granite, he found the rectangular outline of a doorway that had been mortared shut from the inside. They opened it the next morning, carefully, with a chisel and a rubber mallet and an excruciating slowness, because the granite was original and Marcie refused to damage it. The mortar that had sealed the doorway was different from the mortar of the rest of the tower. Newer, finer, the work of someone who had wanted the door to be hidden but had still respected the building enough to seal it cleanly. Behind the doorway was a small chamber, perhaps 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep, dry and cool, with a low granite ceiling and a slate floor. It was full of trunks, 6 wooden sea chests, 2 metal strong boxes, and a long oak cabinet built directly into the granite wall. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but otherwise pristine. The chamber was so well sealed that humidity had never reached it. The chests were locked. The cabinet was not. Inside the cabinet, in careful chronological order, were ledgers, logbooks, maritime charts annotated by hand, a bound stack of letters tied with red string, 3 bound manuscripts, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather portfolio holding the structural engineering plans for Tide Flint Point Light, dated 1886, signed by the original engineer. She sat down on the slate floor and held the portfolio in her lap and did not move for a long time. Patty stood in the doorway watching her. "Persephone never showed you this room," Marcie said quietly. "In 53 years. No. Did she know it was here?" Patty was quiet for a long moment. "I think she sealed it." It took Marcie 2 weeks to begin to understand what she had found, and it took another 6 months for the world outside Penmerrow Harbor to begin to understand. The chests, when they were carefully opened by a maritime conservator, contained the personal records of every keeper who had served at Tide Flint Point Light from 1887 to 1968. 81 years of daily logs, weather observations, shipping records, rescue accounts, and personal correspondence. The bound manuscripts were Persephone's own writings, 3 volumes of unpublished maritime history covering the entire stretch of the Maine coast between Mount Desert Island and Penobscot Bay. The architectural drawings were not just plans. They were a complete documentary record of an unusual and obscure construction technique used only on 6 lighthouses along the New England coast, 4 of which had been demolished in the 20th century. 2 of the others had collapsed. Tide Flint Point was the last intact example. The maritime historian who eventually came to evaluate the find, a woman named Dr. Yolanda Threadgill, who taught at the University of Maine and had been writing about coastal preservation for 30 years, sat at Marcie's card table on a Tuesday in October and said, in a voice that was quieter than the situation seemed to call for, "Mrs. Thornapple, do you understand what is in this room?" "I think I do. This is the most significant private archive of 19th century New England lighthouse keeping that has ever been found. The drawings alone are extraordinary. The complete keeper records make this collection nationally important. I want to be very careful about what I'm about to ask you, but what do you intend to do with it?" Marcie looked across the table at her. "I intend," she said slowly, "to keep it. We're about Tide Flint Point spread the way news spreads in small coastal towns, slowly at first, then all at once." Dr. Threadgill brought a colleague from the National Park Service in late October. The colleague brought 2 more specialists in November. By December, the Maine Lighthouse Heritage Trust had formally requested permission to include Tide Flint Point in their inventory of historically protected structures. By February, a small article appeared in Down East magazine. By March, a longer feature ran in the Portland Press Herald. Marcie did not seek the attention. She granted interviews when asked, answered questions about the restoration as plainly as she could, and was careful, every time, to credit Patty and Persephone before she credited herself. She did not mention Lionel. She did not mention the divorce. But the Press Herald article was picked up by an aggregator, and the aggregator sent it to the wires, and the wires sent it everywhere. Lionel saw it on a Tuesday morning in early April, 2 days after his 5th wedding anniversary with Skye. He arrived at Tide Flint Point on a Saturday in mid-April, 18 months after the divorce had been finalized, in a black SUV that he parked at the end of the access road because he did not want to risk the underside of the vehicle on the washouts. Marcie watched him walk up the path from the kitchen window of the cottage. She had not seen him in person since the last court date. He had aged, she noticed. Not dramatically. Lionel had always taken care of his appearance, but visibly in the small ways that 50 years of knowing a face allowed her to read. He knocked on the red door. She opened it, but did not invite him in. "Marcie, Lionel, you look—" He paused, searching for the right word. "You look well. What do you want?" He smiled the small, practiced smile she had watched him use on clients for 50 years. "I read the article. I had no idea about any of this. I wanted to come up and see for myself, and to congratulate you. This is an extraordinary thing you've done." "Thank you," Marcie said evenly. "Goodbye." She started to close the door. He stepped forward, not aggressively, but enough to keep it from closing. "Marcie, wait. I'm not here to make trouble. I like to talk." She let the door stay open. She did not move from the threshold. "You have 10 minutes." He looked at the cottage behind her. He looked at the tower. He took in, with the assessing eye of a man who had been in the construction business for 50 years, the new slate roof, the repointed mortar, the reglazed windows, the rebuilt walkway. She watched him calculate. "I'd like to make you an offer," he said, "on the property. It's not for sale. Hear me out. The article says the Heritage Trust valued the structures alone at over $500,000 now that they're restored. Add the historical archive, the drawings, we're talking real money, Marcie. More than you can manage at your age. Frankly, I can offer you $800,000. Cash. You could buy a lovely place anywhere on the coast. Be near your children. Be near Cameron's family. She just had another baby, did you know? Her name is Wren. She's almost a year old." The mention of the granddaughter she had never been told about hit Marcie harder than anything Lionel had said. She did not let it show on her face. 50 years of practice at not letting things show on her face had finally, at last, become useful. 800,000, she repeated. "It's a generous number, Marcie. It's also less than half of what the Heritage Trust has appraised it at." Lionel's expression flickered. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Marcie to confirm what she had suspected from the second she had seen him on the path. He had not come because he had no idea about any of this. He had come because he had a very precise idea about all of it. He had been doing his homework. "Lionel," she said quietly, "you didn't drive 11 hours to congratulate me." "Marcie, I want you to leave." He left. He did not push. He did not threaten. He smiled the small practice smile again and walked back down the path to his SUV, and she watched him go from the kitchen window with her hands flat on the counter and her heart beating in her ears. She knew, even before she finished pouring her coffee, that he was not done. The certified letter arrived 16 days later. It was from a law firm in Hartford, Connecticut, that Marcie had never heard of, and the language inside it was as elegant and as venomous as anything she had ever read. The complaint alleged that during the divorce proceedings 2 years earlier, Marcie had failed to disclose her potential interest in her great-aunt's estate, despite the fact that her great-aunt was, at that time, in declining health and her likely passing was foreseeable. The complaint alleged that any inheritance Marcie had received from a relative whose health was known to be failing during the marital period constituted, under Connecticut equitable distribution principles, an asset that should have been disclosed and divided. The complaint sought 50% of the appraised current value of Tide Flint Point Light and its associated archive, plus damages, plus attorney's fees, plus a constructive trust to prevent Marcie from selling, transferring, or substantially altering the property pending resolution. The total Lionel was demanding came to just under $1 million. Marcie read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she set it down on the card table and walked outside, and stood at the cliff edge for a long time, looking at the gray Atlantic and the granite tower behind her, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt steady. She walked back inside. She picked up the phone. She called Mr. Rensselaer in Bangor, and she said, "I need a litigation attorney." Mr. Rensselaer recommended a woman named Marisol Quesada. She had a small practice in Portland. She had spent 15 years as a senior litigator at a Boston firm before going independent, and she specialized in complex equitable distribution disputes. She drove up to Tide Flint Point on a Wednesday morning in late April, sat at the card table reading the complaint with her coffee cooling beside her, and when she finished, she set the papers down and said, "Mrs. Thornapple, this lawsuit is garbage." "Tell me why," Marcie said. 3 reasons. First, the divorce decree included standard mutual release language for any non-disclosed assets. Connecticut courts almost never reopen on that basis without proof of intentional concealment. And there isn't any here. You didn't know your great-aunt was sick, and frankly, neither did anyone in your immediate family. Second, an inheritance is, under Connecticut law, presumptively separate property unless commingled, and you didn't even know about it during the marriage. Third, and most importantly, the timeline doesn't work. Your great-aunt died in August. Your divorce was finalized 2 months earlier. The estate was not in probate. There was no asset to disclose. She paused. This isn't a real lawsuit. This is harassment dressed up in legal clothes. Your ex-husband knows he can't win. He's hoping the cost of defending will force you to settle. How much will defending cost? Marisol named a figure. Marcie went very still. I have about $30,000 left, Marcie said quietly. I know. Mr. Rensselaer told me. I'll work this on a flat fee of $15,000, and I'll petition the court for fee shifting on the grounds of bad faith litigation. If we win, and we will win, your husband will pay the rest of my bill himself. Marcie looked at her across the card table. Why? Marisol smiled for the first time. Because I read the Press Herald article, Mrs. Thornapple. And because my mother was a fisherman's widow on Vinyl Haven who lost her house to a man very much like your ex-husband when I was 11 years old. So if it's all the same to you, I consider this a favor I'd like to do. Marcie agreed. The lawsuit dragged through the summer. Lionel's attorneys filed motion after motion, requested document after document, scheduled depositions, and tried twice to obtain a temporary restraining order preventing Marcie from continuing restoration work. All of those efforts failed. Marisol was, as she had promised, very good at her job. Bryson called in late June. Mom, you need to settle this. Dad is spending serious money on this lawsuit. He's not going to back down. You're 70 years old. Why are you doing this to yourself? I'm not doing anything to myself, Bryson. Your father is doing this to me. That's not. Mom, he says he made you a fair offer. $800,000. That's a lot of money. You could be comfortable. I'm comfortable now. In a lighthouse. Mom, please. Bryson, I love you. You are my son. But I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left doing what your father wants me to do, or what you want me to do, or what anyone wants me to do except myself. If that means we don't speak for a while, I'm sorry. But I'm not selling this lighthouse, and I'm not settling this lawsuit, and I'm not going to be quiet anymore. Bryson did not respond for several seconds. Then he hung up. He did not call again for a long time. The journalist arrived in mid-July. His name was Tobin Whitcomb. He wrote feature pieces for The Atlantic, and he had been pitched the story by Dr. Threadgill at an academic conference in June. He spent 4 days at Tide Flint Point. He interviewed Marcie at length. He interviewed Patty, Wally Bissett at the hardware store, Esme at the diner, Dr. Threadgill, Marisol, and Mr. Rensselaer. He did not interview Lionel because Lionel's attorneys refused all requests, but he obtained the full filing from the Hartford court, which was public record, and he obtained the divorce settlement, which was also public record once he knew where to look. His article ran on a Sunday in late August. It was titled The Engineer Who Was Never Allowed to Be One: How a 70-Year-Old Marine Engineering Student Became the Restorer of America's Last Granite Lighthouse. It was 6,300 words. It was meticulously documented. It included photographs of Marcie working on the tower, of the discovered chamber, of Persephone's manuscripts, and of the $18,000 divorce settlement document side by side with the $12 million valuation of Lionel's construction firm. It also included, in the final third of the piece, a careful, devastating account of the lawsuit Lionel had filed. The article went viral within 72 hours. It was not the kind of viral that lasts a week and disappears. It was the kind that lodges in the cultural conversation. It was shared by women's organizations, by historic preservation groups, by engineering professional societies, by divorce attorneys who used it as a teaching example. The headline circulated for months. Marcie received over 4,000 emails in the first week. She also received, on the 11th day after the article ran, a one-line voicemail from Lionel's attorney withdrawing the lawsuit. Marisol's fee was paid in full. The wires picked it up. The morning shows called. Marcie declined every television interview. She did not want her face on a screen. She wanted only to be left alone to keep working on the tower, which was still not finished, and which she intended to finish before the 2nd anniversary of her great-aunt's death. But she did agree to one thing. She agreed, after a long conversation with Patty and Dr. Threadgill, to open Tide Flint Point Light to the public for 1 week each summer, beginning the following June as a small heritage site and learning residency. She did not want it to be a museum. She wanted it to be a place where women in their 60s and 70s and 80s could come and see what could be done with patience, with hands, with knowledge that had been waiting in a basement for 50 years for someone to remember it was there. The first residency was scheduled for the week of June 14th. 42 women applied for the 8 available slots. The first residency week began on June 14th, 2 years and 1 month after Marcie had walked up the path to Tide Flint Point with a duffel bag and a folded photograph. 8 women arrived on a Sunday afternoon, ranging in age from 58 to 81, carrying duffels and notebooks, and the cautious hope of people who had read an article and wondered if the woman in it might still be there if they came looking. Marcie greeted each of them at the end of the path. Patty carried their bags. Esme had cooked the welcome dinner. That week, Marcie taught them how to read a structure, how to assess granite, how to mix mortar. She taught them, mostly, that knowledge does not expire just because no one has asked you to use it for 50 years. On the last evening, the oldest of the women, an 81-year-old retired geologist named Bernadine, said, "Mrs. Thornapple, I want to thank you. I have not done anything with my hands in 12 years. I forgot I could." Marcie, who had spent 50 years not crying in front of other people because Lionel had never liked it when she did, cried. The car arrived 3 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday in early July. Marcie was on the cliff edge measuring the last broken section of the walkway when she heard the engine, and she turned, and she saw a small blue sedan parked behind her Subaru at the end of the access road. A woman got out of the driver's side. The woman was in her early 40s, with Marcie's own dark hair gone half to gray, and she stood beside the car for a long moment before she opened the back door and lifted out a small child. The child was perhaps 2.5 years old. She had Cameron's nose and Lionel's eyes, and she was holding, in one fist, a yellow plastic shovel. Marcie set down her tape measure. Cameron walked up the path slowly, carrying Wren, who was looking around with the wide, solemn attention of a small child who has been told she is going somewhere important. When they reached the cottage, Cameron stopped. "Mom, Cameron, I read the article. I read it the day it came out. I have read it 11 times since." Her voice broke on the word 11. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything. I am so sorry I sided with him. I'm so sorry I called you bitter. I am so sorry that the only reason I am here today is that a magazine article had to tell me who my mother actually was, because I was too scared of my father to find out for myself." Marcie did not speak for a long moment. She was looking at Wren, who was looking back at her with the same calm, evaluative gaze that Cameron had worn as a toddler. "Hello," Wren said. "Hello, Wren. Are you Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart. I am." Wren considered this for a moment. Then she held up the yellow plastic shovel, very seriously, and said, "Mom said I could help." Marcie laughed. It was the first laugh that had come out of her, free and unguarded, and longer than she could remember. She let them in. She made coffee for Cameron and put a small mug of milk on the card table for Wren. They talked for 3 hours. Cameron cried twice. Marcie cried once more. Wren, having been promised work, was eventually given a small flat trowel and shown how to push wet mortar into a shallow joint Patty had prepared for her on the south wall. They stayed the night. They stayed the next night. They stayed a week. Bryson never came. Marcie thought about him sometimes, about the boy he had been before he learned that approval from his father was a currency worth more than approval from his mother. She did not call him. She left the door open, the way you leave a door open for a cat that may or may not come back, and she went on with her life. Lionel, she heard from Cameron, had separated from Sky 8 months after the lawsuit collapsed. Marcie felt nothing about it. Not anger, not satisfaction, just the clean, distant nothing of a chapter that had been closed for so long that it no longer remembered being open. 3 years after the first residency, Tide Flint Point Light hosted 72 women across 4 annual residencies. Dr. Threadgill's research papers on Persephone's archive had been published in 2 journals. The Maine Lighthouse Heritage Trust had formally designated the property as a protected historic site. The lantern room was lit again, not with a Coast Guard beacon, but with a small ceremonial lamp that Marcie turned on every night at dusk and turned off every morning at dawn, the way Persephone had done for 68 years before her. She was 73 years old now. Her hands were still calloused. She lived in the cottage year-round with a small wood stove and a solar panel array Patty had helped her install, and she did the work she had wanted to do at 22. Finally, 51 years late, with the granite tower behind her and the gray Atlantic in front of her, and Wren visiting every summer while Cameron rebuilt her own life. If you have ever been told that you waited too long, if you have ever shelved your own dream so completely that you forgot what it looked like, if you have ever stood in a driveway with a cardboard box and an ex-husband who did not come outside, share this with someone who needs to remember that knowledge does not expire. That 70 is not too late. That some lights are meant only to be kept. And that the most powerful comeback in any life is not revenge. It is finally becoming who you were always meant to be. This is Dreams Don't Age. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.